Hey everybody, this is section 4 of chapter 3 of Charles Bettelheim's class struggle in the USSR. The third period, 1930 to 1941, part 1, the dominated. Chapter 3 is titled The Kolkhoz System. And section 4 is titled The Incomes of Kolkhozniks and Kolkhoz Cadres. Before examining what incomes were received by the kolkhozniks from the collective farm, it is necessary to give an indication of how these revenues were fixed. To do this, certain, quote, rules of the kolkhoz system should be recalled. A. The composition of incomes distributed by the kolkhozes and how they were divided. Incomes of the kolkhozniks depended on the incomes of their kolkhoz. The incomes of their kolkhoz in the incomes in their kolkhoz's turn depended on a multiplicity of elements over which the management of each kolkhoz (and even more so the kolkhozniks) had usually little influence. The scale of the different types of production, mainly determined by the production plans and the means put at the disposition of the kolkhoz. The exactions that the state levied on this production, the prices which might be paid for part of the output taken by the state. All this determined for a given year the gross annual receipts of each kolkhoz. However, what would be distributed to the kolkhozniks did not directly depend on the annual gross receipts of their kolkhozes, but rather from what was left after other exactions had been levied, leaving the balance of receipts payable to the kolkhozniks. New heading 1. The balance payable to the kolkhozniks. This balance was obtained by deducting from the gross receipt various, quote, external and, quote, internal charges. The, quote, external charges were the payments that the kolkhoz had to make to the treasury or to various state organs, for example, the machine and tractor stations, The, quote, internal, end quote, charges were intended to finance the internal accumulation of the kolkhoz and its administrative expenses, notably the wages of its cadres. The amount of all these charges depends principally on decisions made by authorities external to the kolkhozes. After the kolkhoz had dealt with all these charges, at a time when gross receipts were low because of the agricultural crisis, the deliveries made to the state, and the low prices that were paid to the producers for agricultural products. After the kolkhoz had dealt with all these charges, at a time when gross receipts were low because of the agricultural crisis, Jesus Christ. At a time when gross receipts were low because of the agricultural crisis, the deliveries made to the state, and the low prices that were paid to the producers of agricultural products, the balance remaining for distribution to the kolkhoz's members was pathetic. It was offered either in kind or in money. Footnote: it would be tedious to analyze the receipts in kind and in money of the kolkhozes. In fact, we have already given some indications on the evolution of agricultural production and on the prices paid by the state for this production. Also, we shall see later what were the incomes paid to the kolkhozniks. Those wishing to study for 1935 to 39, the way in which developed the distribution of receipts in kind and in many of the kolkhozes may refer to H. Wronski's remuneration. See also the article by M. Viltsam, which is in Russian. End footnote. It was delivered on the basis of the, quote, Labor Day, end quote, unit of account. Two, bookkeeping in, quote, Labor Days, end quote, or Trudodny, the production norms. Throughout the year, the work of each kolkhoznik was recorded in units of account, known as, quote, Labor Days, end quote, or Trudodny. This unit of account corresponded to the achievement of a certain task. However, according to the nature of the achieved task, a workday entitled the attribution of a smaller or greater number of Trudodny. For a piece of work which is regarded as, quote, easy, end quote, a workday could only represent 0.75 Trudodny. But for work described as, quote, difficult, end quote, a workday represented 1.5 Trudodny. This principle assumed that the different form items of work were classed according to category. In June 1930, a circular sanctioned such a classification. In January 1931, on the basis of recommendations from various institutes, a kolkhoz conference classed work into 4 groups in which the equivalent in Trudodny of a workday varied between 0.75 and 1.5. In 1933, within the framework of the struggle against egalitarianism, within the framework of the, quote, struggle against egalitarianism, end quote, work was divided into 7 groups in which the equivalent of a workday varied from 0.5 to 2.0 Trudodny, that is a ratio of 1 to 4, end parenthesis. For a kolkhoznik to be considered as having provided 1 Trudodin, it was necessary not only that the kolkhoznik should have spent a certain time to achieve a certain piece of work, but also quite often that the kolkhoznik satisfied certain production norms. These production norms proliferated from 1933, at least for manual work. New heading, heading 3, calculating the value of a, quote, Trudodin, end quote, and individual income. The income which corresponded to a, quote, Trudodin was not fixed in advance. It was calculated by dividing the balance available for distribution in a kolkhoz by the total number of Trudodny provided by all the kolkhozniks of that kolkhoz during the course of the year. This division gave the, quote, effective value, end quote, of a Trudodin for the year in a given kolkhoz. This division gave the, quote, effective value, end quote, of a Trudodin for the year in a given kolkhoz. As for the individual income allocated to each kolkhoznik by virtue of his, quote, collective work, end quote, this is obtained by multiplying the, quote, effective value, end quote, of the Trudodin by the number of Trudodny which he had provided, adding in some cases a basic wage, largely for the cadres, and bonuses. The income distributed in this way was partly composed of a sum of money and partly by products of the kolkhoz. The system of distribution was both burdensome and complicated. It subjected the direct producers to a series of rules and norms that were fixed externally. The direct producers' effective receipts did not depend, contrary to what was officially declared, on the, quote, quantity and quality of their work, end quote, but on the way the work of each was, quote, evaluated, end quote, computed, and, quote, checked, end quote. In addition, what each kolkhoznik received also depended on the work to which he had been allocated and the, quote, results, end quote, achieved by the collective farm, quote, results, end quote, on which personal work and the, quote, decisions, end quote, of the kolkhozniks had only minimal influence. Finally, each person received what was due to him only a long time after the work had been done. For work done in the fall, quote, remuneration, end quote, would be received only about a year later. That is, after the harvest had been taken in and all the accounting had been done. Heading B. The size of income paid by the kolkhoz to the kolkhozniks. The circumstances in which the kolkhoz is, quote, remunerated, end quote, the kolkhozniks meant that there was a great differentiation of incomes. Such a differentiation limits the usefulness of figures relating to the, quote, average income, end quote, received by kolkhozniks by virtue of their, quote, collective work, end quote. However, this average income is not entirely devoid of interest, because it allows a certain number of comparisons to be made. We will therefore begin by giving some facts about this income. New heading. Heading 1. The average income received by kolkhozniks from the kolkhoz. Statistics relating to the income of kolkhozniks are especially lacking and contradictory. The figures used here are those quoted by A. Arut Union. Arut Union. Footnote. A. Arut Union is among the Soviet researchers who have published the most detailed studies on the problems of the peasantry and agriculture. End footnote. From these it emerges that in 1940 the average income received by a kolkhoznik from the kolkhoz rose to 12 rubles per month. This figure may be compared with an average income of 22 rubles for a worker in a sovkhoz and 34 rubles for a wage earner in industry. Even if it were accepted that the income derived from their individual plots and livestock doubled, the total income received by the kolkhozniks, this income remained very much lower than the income of an industrial wage earner. It is quite close to that of a sovkhoz wage earner, the latter usually having at his disposal not an individual plot, but a garden, which increased his income by several rubles per month. Footnote. It will be noted that 1940 is less favorable to the peasants than 1937, during which, according to official statistics, a kolkhoz household received 376 rubles per year, plus 17 quintals of grain. End footnote. These figures confirm that in 1940 the collective economy of the kolkhozes was incapable of assuring a living wage for their members. These figures confirm that in 1940 the collective economy of the kolkhozes was incapable of assuring a living wage for their members. The distributed, quote, remuneration, end quote, did not ensure the reproduction of the work energy of the kolkhozniks and their families, hence the absolute necessity for the cultivation of, quote, individual plots, end quote, for familial livestock raising, and for recourse to sales on the, quote, free, end quote, market. The distributed, quote, remuneration, end quote, did not ensure the reproduction of the work energy of the kolkhozniks and their families, hence the absolute necessity for the cultivation of, quote, individual plots, end quote, for familial livestock raising and for course to sales on the, quote, free, end quote, market. All this is connected with the causes and effects of the peasant resistance to, quote, collectivization, end quote, in the form in which it was carried out. It may be said that the majority of the kolkhozniks in 1940 could buy practically nothing, not even industrial products that could be regarded as, quote, everyday, end quote. This may be confirmed by quoting retail prices of certain consumer goods produced by industry. Prices are of 1939, with, in parentheses, the 1928 prices when available, in parentheses. A meter of cotton cloth was from 2.7 to 2.07 to 2.73 rubles, parenthesis, 0.34, in parenthesis. A meter of woolen cloth about 150 rubles, parenthesis, 11.35, in parenthesis. A pair of men's leather boots was from 42 to 90 rubles, parenthesis, 10.8, in parenthesis. To summarize, quote, collectivization, end quote, therefore entailed a considerable reduction in main agricultural production and a collapse of the standard of living of the workers in the countryside. A collapse of the standard of living of the workers in the countryside. From this, it should not be concluded that, quote, collectivization, end quote, was a total failure, because collectivization's real objective was not to improve the living conditions of the peasant masses, but to create the conditions for their maximal exploitation, so as to assure a rapid expansion of state industry, and in general, this objective was achieved. However, this, quote, tree of average income should not hide the, quote, forest, end quote, of income inequalities. The inequalities can be seen as much between kolkhozes as inside each kolkhoz. 2. Income inequalities between kolkhozes. A detailed analysis of income inequalities between kolkhozes would require much time and, moreover, would be difficult to carry out well with the present availability of documentation. We shall therefore limit ourselves to pointing out that the circumstances of several tens of thousands of kolkhozes were such that at the end of the 1930s, either they could not pay any monetary remuneration to their members for trudodny, or the remuneration which they could pay was very inferior to the average payment. Thus, in 1939, 15,700 kolkhozes had been subjected to such burdens that they were unable to pay any monetary remuneration to their members, and 46,000 others could only pay, at the most, 0.2 rubles per, quote, workday, end quote. Thus, in 1939, 15,700 kolkhozes had been subjected to such burdens that they were unable to pay any monetary remuneration of to their members, and 46,000 others could only pay at the most 0.2 rubles per, quote, workday, end quote. Section 3, or heading 3, internal inequalities in the kolkhoz. To the inequalities between kolkhozes should be added inequalities internal to each kolkhoz. The latter were the result of a policy whose principal elements were the following. A. The distinction made between work of execution and work of direction. The work of execution was, quote, remunerated, end quote, exclusively on the basis of accounting in trudodny, or workdays. The second was remunerated, the work of direction, in addition by fixed wages and various bonuses. B. The fixing of norms that were more or less easy to achieve. Any overfulfillment of the norm created the right to a proportional increase of remuneration. Conversely, in the case of non-fulfillment of the norm, the remuneration of the kolkhoznik was reduced. This brought about differences of effective remuneration in a range of 6 to 1 between the best paid manual worker and the worst paid. For example, the first could earn more than 28 rubles monthly, in an average kolkhoz of 1940, and the second only 4.8 rubles. C. In 1940, income inequalities between kolkhozniks of the same kolkhoz were made even greater by the establishment of a system of bonuses that were to be added to what was paid by virtue of the trudodny. Footnote. See Decree of December 31st, 1940. These bonuses were paid to members of brigades, or teams, who, quote, exceeded, end quote, their production plan or their productivity plan. As a general rule, they were fixed in the form of a payment of a percentage of what was produced above the brigade plan. The distribution of these bonuses was itself subjected to various regulations. D. The inequalities in the remuneration of manual workers, connected with the classification of tasks, to the fixing of norms more or less easy to fulfill, to the nature of the tasks allocated to the lower kolkhozniks by the chiefs of brigade and teams or by the managers of livestock farms, and to inequalities due to the bonuses, must be added the inequalities resulting from the higher rates of remuneration allowed to the managing personnel of the kolkhozes and the, quote, skilled, end quote, cadres of the latter. Moreover, part of this remuneration was fixed directly in money terms, which was not the case for the ordinary kolkhoznik. On the eve of World War II, the chairman of a kolkhoz received a fixed salary varying from 25 to 400 rubles monthly, the average being 150 rubles, end parenthesis. This salary may be compared with the average total, quote, remuneration, end quote, of a kolkhoznik, which, as quoted above, was 12 rubles. In addition to this salary, the chairman received an attribution which varied from 45 to 90 trudodny monthly, however, on, quote, ordinary, end quote, kolkhoznik. So I think it's supposed to be N. However, a, quote, ordinary, end quote, kolkhoznik who received no wage was usually credited with about 15 trudodny workdays monthly, and often less, end parenthesis. This, quote, remuneration, end quote, of kolkhoz chairman depended on the extent of the cultivated area of, quote, his, end quote, kolkhoz during the year. In addition to this salary and his attribution of trudodny, the kolkhoz chairman received a bonus equaling 15 to 40% of his total salary, by virtue of plan over fulfillment. Finally, after 3 years of service, he received a supplementary bonus of 5 to 15% for each year of service. Agronomists, skilled livestock workers, plant and livestock specialists, usually members of the Council of Administration, received high contractual credit in trudodny workdays, and for the fulfillment of their, quote, their plan, end quote, a bonus equal to 70% of that received by the chairman. The brigadiers and other cadres were automatically credited with 1.5 times the number of trudodny achieved by the average kolkhoznik, plus various bonuses. Thus, an important part of the available resources of the kolkhozes was absorbed by the managing cadres, the, quote, specialist, end quote, the brigadiers and administrative cadres, which correspondingly reduced the incomes of the, quote, ordinary, end quote, kolkhozniks. Thus, an important part of the available resources of the kolkhozes was absorbed by the managing cadres, the, quote, specialists, end quote, the brigadiers and the administrative cadres, which correspondingly reduced the income of the, quote, ordinary, end quote, kolkhozniks. Without sufficiently detailed and meaningful statistics, it is very difficult to make a true comparison between the income inequalities in the countryside at the end of the new economic policy and the end of the 1930s. However, nothing suggests that these inequalities had diminished. What changed were those who benefited from the privileged incomes and the conditions which allowed them to thus benefit. It should be noted that to the inequalities in the incomes distributed by the kolkhozes should be added other inequalities which increase still more the differentiation of standards of life within the kolkhozes. One of these sources of inequality involved housing. Thus, A. Arut Union, using an investigation made in 1935 in the village of Terpenia, or Terpeniye, parenthesis, situated in the Ukraine in Zaporozhye region, or Zaporozhye region, Zaporozhe region, and parenthesis, states that there were considerable differences in the comfort of accommodation depending on whether it was used by skilled or unskilled workers. All the accommodation of non-manual skilled workers had proper floors, whereas 30% of the kolkhozniks' dwellings had earthen floors. Comfortless dwelling. Footnote. Actually, this is I missed a footnote. In 1932, before the introduction of the bonus system described above, auditing organs reckoned that administrative services, parenthesis, employing only a small part of the personnel, in parenthesis, absorbed 20 to 25% of the kolkhoz incomes. A decree of September 10, 1933, then tried to limit this item of expense. End footnote. Comfortless dwellings, usually situated in small villages or hamlets, belonged essentially to unskilled manual workers. Another element in the differentiation of living conditions was the scale of familial agriculture. Thus, in 1940, 1/3 of kolkhoz families did not have a cow. However, the non-possession of a cow was typical, parenthesis, in 1928, and parenthesis, of a poor peasant household, because this animal is essential for providing the peasant household with milk products. Thus, in 1940, 1/3 of kolkhoz families did not have a cow. However, the non-possession of a cow was typical, parenthesis, in 1928, and parenthesis, of a poor peasant household, because a cow was essential for providing the peasant household with milk products. Milk products were necessary for nourishment and were a source of monetary income. Moreover, stable manure was an important factor for the fertility of the plot. The available information shows that the households of the manual workers were the least favored in questions of livestock raising and plots. Thus, at Terpenia, or Terpeniye, in 1935, in the kolkhoz sector, 100% of, quote, skilled non-manual workers, end quote, grew their own crops and had an orchard, whereas these percentages fell respectively to 31% and 79% for unskilled manual workers. To summarize, the, quote, collective, end quote, farm was characterized by a very much polarized social structure, by deep economic inequalities, and by relationships of domination that a minority of cadres exercised on the mass of kolkhozniks, who were overexploited and were literally reduced to short rations. However, these facts should not hide the circumstance that, in the overall social structure, the cadres and managers of the kolkhozes were themselves at the bottom of a complex hierarchical system, whose pressure forced them to push to a maximum the exploitation of the, quote, ordinary, end quote, kolkhozniks. The inferior situation of the cadres of the, quote, collective, end quote, farms can be clearly seen when analyzing the subordination of the kolkhozes to the requirements of accumulation and state procurement. That's the end of section 4. of Charles Bettelheim's of Chapter 3 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, 1930 to 1941. Section 4 is titled Incomes of Kolkhozniks and kolkhoz cadres. And this chapter is called The Kolkhoz System. Thank you for listening. Next section is section 5. And section 5 is titled The Subordination of the Kolkhozes to the Requirements of State Accumulation. Thanks for listening.